Welcome to talk about Postgres and Postgres permissions and privileges and roles. My name is Ryan Booz, and I've been at this Postgres database thing for most of my career. I've been a .NET developer, I've led database teams, but I've always really loved and enjoyed databases. And for a lot of my career, it was SQL Server. And then about 7 years ago, I switched jobs after being at a company for almost 15 years. And they forgot to tell me during the interview process that they had been working to move off of SQL Server to Postgres. And it wasn't until the first day that they handed me a connection string, and I said, what's this? I came to be your SQL Server expert. And so I've been in the Postgres community now for about 7 years. I've done DevRel at a few places, Timescale. I just finished at Redgate Software 2 days ago after being there for a few years. Now work for a company called pganalyze, which is a monitoring tool for Postgres. I am generally Ryan Booz anywhere I am. I am active on X and Blue Sky and some other places. I have a blog, and every so often something might show up on the YouTube channel. So I love talking about Postgres. I'll leave this up for 15 seconds. If any of you have used SQL Server over the years, you may know the name Grant Fritchie. So I worked with Grant at Redgate, and we spent about a year writing this book. You can get a free PDF of it from Redgate. They're not my employer anymore, but I think it's a great resource. And go ahead, go grab it. It's a good intro book. We just released it a couple months ago. And hopefully we'll keep it updated as we go. All right. So we're going to talk about roles and privileges. Now, I've been to Stir Trek once before. I'm a regular attender of CodeMash. And so I know that this area is a lot of, these are great dev conferences. You know, there's a lot of people here. We're talking about front end. We're talking about architecture, talking about, you know, even some soft skills, things like that. And so roles and privileges in a database that maybe everyone's not really using was a little bit odd, but I'm glad they selected the talk, and I love talking about security. And as a former SQL Server user and developer, I will say that this is one area that completely just threw me for the first maybe 2 years I was using Postgres, really trying to understand exactly how to do this well and all the problems we used to get into. So here's the agenda. We're going to quickly talk about the building blocks, roles, special roles, and so forth. And then hopefully I'll have just a few minutes to do a really brief demo, because one or two of these things, I think until you see it, it doesn't necessarily click as quickly as I needed it to way back when. So let's quickly talk about the building blocks. And here, I will also recall this. The last time I spoke at Star Trek, I didn't know that the camera wasn't moving, and so I love to move, and suddenly I was not on screen. So I'll do my best to stay here if you happen to be in another room, but anyway. The building blocks are this. Number one, I can't take any credit for the Postgres core development team as an open source project 30 plus years ago calling the instance on the computer that's running a cluster. I'm sorry, they did that, it wasn't me, but we would call it an instance with SQL Server. So you can have multiple clusters running on one machine, and what are many different individual Postgres computers working together called? A cluster. So yeah, it's just really confusing. Every cluster has an HBA conf file, and they have to have their own port for you to connect to. The HBA conf file we'll talk about in just a second. So you have the cluster, and then within the cluster you have roles at the server cluster level and databases at the server cluster level. And in some other databases, those roles are partially at the instance level, and then they're also replicated in various ways down within the database. And that's not how Postgres works, and that's one of the confusing pieces that really trips people up as we go. And so really when you get to the roles in databases, this is this interesting thing that in Postgres, every connection to the Postgres instance is to a database specifically. If you happen to have been a SQL Server user or other databases, you get a connection to the database server, and then you tell it what database you want to use. In Postgres, every connection connects to a database. Therefore, you have to have a role to own a database, and you have to have a database to connect to. And so when the server is initiated, you always get one database and at least in one user. That's why everywhere we go, we usually have a user Postgres and a database Postgres. We need that one first thing in order to be able to connect and even do anything else as the next step. And this HBA file is host-based authentication. It's very much like a firewall, and it's the first layer of authentication, just like you would expect a firewall to be. So if I try and connect to the Postgres instance and my connection parameters don't match something in this file, I don't even get to talk to Postgres, right? I get stopped right there at the network layer. And really, it's what you would expect a kind of firewall to be. What clients are allowed to connect, what users from those clients, what authentication method can they use, and then what can they talk to, all right? So what databases, what authentication method, and then who and where are they coming from. Now this example is taken out of the documentation. I'll zoom in on one or two of them really quickly, but it's really configurable. We love regex as Postgres. We have regex searching. We actually do have fuzzy search and fuzzy match and some other stuff. Sorry, came from a separate talk. But you can name very specific things, all databases, a specific database, a regex string of a database. You can reject stuff. You can name different kinds of authentication methods. And this is a top-down, like a firewall, it's a top-down match. So the first rule that matches is the rule that will be taken for that connection that's being attempted. So if I happen to accidentally match the, if I had this last IP address on here, I happen to be on that machine, and I didn't realize that this reject was set, I will never be able to connect to anything because it says all users, all databases reject it if it's coming from this computer. And so if the other one wasn't lower, I would not get through. And so just a little bit closer, it's sometimes harder to read in a file like that. Again, a lot of configuration opportunity here for you to really hone in on exactly the kind of authentication you want. And Postgres supports many. We support Kerberos and other ticket-based authentication methods, things like that, on top of password and so forth. All right, so we've gotten past the HBA. Oh, sorry, I always forget this part. Avoid trust. Hopefully that makes sense in today's world. If you spin up a Postgres Docker image or you install Postgres on your local computer, it will have a trust-based connection set up in HBA for the local instance coming from localhost. It's just an easy, quick way to get in, and that allows me to say, pSQL, Postgres, and all of a sudden I'm just in and connected. That's really the only reason, and generally you change that pretty quickly anyway, but try not to use trust. If you are going to use password, we had MD5 for many years, about 6 years ago, maybe 5 years ago. That was upgraded to Scram-Shaw 256. And so there's some documentation on how to upgrade that as you go, and I'd encourage you to do that. So we've gotten through the connection. My computer, my host, whatever is now allowed to connect to the database, and now we actually have to be somebody. We have to be a role to do something. And so with that, we have what we call roles. They obviously own the objects, all the things you would think about, databases and schemas and tables, functions, yada, yada, yada. As a role, we have cluster-level privileges, right? So there's kind of two sets of things. One is, as a role when I connect, what are some of the things I can do at the server level, separate from what are the things I can do at the object level, databases, tables, and so forth. And they are two different lists. And a role can be given the authority to grant privilege to other roles, right? They don't have to be, but they can be given that privilege, which can be beneficial, and we'll see why. Now in Postgres, there are only roles. I will even probably in this talk say user and say group. They are the same thing. Semantically, and that goes back to Postgres 8.2, we finally decided to switch over to the SQL standard. Long time ago, it is what it is. So semantically, we say that if a role can log in, we consider that a user of sorts. If the role is set to not be allowed to log in, then we consider that a group. And so the idea being that I create groups with certain sets of privileges, and then I can grant membership into those roles, and that's how I can do kind of distributed, privilege authentication authorization through the database. And I'll give you some examples of what that might look like moving forward. And all that means is this: we actually do still have the alias for create user and create group. They are simply that, an alias to create role. And so by default, if you say create user, it adds the login behind the scenes. That's all it does. That's the only difference. Otherwise, if you say create group, it just keeps the default, which is no login. And then at that layer, as I said, we have these predefined attributes. So they are kind of like privileges for the database server itself. They're predefined, and They kind of map to, there's columns in the PG roles table. If you ever connect to your Postgres database and go look, you'll see that these match up exactly with these listed attributes. The underlined ones are the ones we're going to talk about over the next few slides. Obviously, we're not going to get into replication, bypass, row-level security, and connection stuff. The others are what is most important to our conversation here today. We already talked about login, and we'll talk about inherit in just a minute. But if you do nothing, if you simply say create user and you don't specify any of those specifically, aside from login, if you want a user, that role will be able to inherit privileges. So by default, it can inherit privileges of any other roles it is a member of. You'll see that in a little bit. And it will have unlimited connections, right? So if you want to limit the connections of a specific role, maybe you have a reporting thing that connects every night. And if it gets out of control, it suddenly spins up a bunch of connections and you want to stop that. You could set maybe that role to only have 10 connections or something so that it can't overwhelm the computer at night if something gets out of whack. And then there are role-specific session settings. So a lot of people, bless you, a lot of people I don't think know this. Sorry, for those of you who were not here, someone sneezed, it was habit, I said it anyway. So as you're using Postgres, anywhere you go, anywhere you are using Postgres, in the cloud, locally, what have you, this is one of the really neat things I love about Postgres, is you can actually set, there are hundreds, I have a separate talk on this, but there are hundreds of configuration options in Postgres. Not all of them, but a lot of them can be configured within a session. So I connect, I'm doing some work, and maybe work mem is one of them. It's a very important setting in Postgres that determines, quite honestly, how efficient running a query can be if you have enough memory. And so normally, we only keep that at maybe 16 megs max in most situations, and there's various reasons for that. But again, coming back to that report role, if I have a really heavy report that runs every night, and I know it needs more work memory for its connection to run efficiently and be done in less than 3 hours, I can set that role so that every time it connects, it gets that specific setting. And there are dozens and dozens of these that you can set. And then if you ever want to unset them, you just simply alter the role and reset that specific configuration. Others might be JIT. You could set, I usually have a whole bunch of examples that are not coming to mind at the moment, but it is very helpful. So great, so we've connected. We now have created a role. We kind of have a clue what those are. And now we need to talk about some of these special roles. Now, the first one we need to talk about is super user. Now, you would hope that if someone has the super user privilege, they kind of, I actually didn't pick this because of like movie stuff tonight and the Marvel universe. I've had this for a while. But you hope that the super user is kind of like your friendly neighborhood Spider-Man. Lots of power, but knows, with great power comes great responsibility. And you kind of think, that's got to be how this is all going to work out. In reality, the super user is absolutely 100% can do anything and destroy anything at once. And the reason for that is that the super user is a very necessary role within Postgres. It is the role that gets created immediately upon the instantiation of the server. So as part of the server being created, after it's installed, the first role that gets created is a super user. And is kind of necessary because we need a role that can do things like create other roles and create databases and do things. However, the super user process role is essentially an if statement in code. As long as they can authenticate, anywhere in Postgres that a role would be checked to see if it can do something, it says, essentially, if super user or has this privilege, and just lets you do it. So as a super user, you have complete control over every database, every object, everything. It is necessary sometimes. So if you don't have the super user role, there may be one or two things that you can't do. But there's now ways around that, and I'll cover that at the very end. Most cloud providers then obviously will not give you super user because you could get yourself in a state really quickly, and that's not fun for anybody. And so instead, we want to create a super user-like role, someone that we can really trust but can't absolutely destroy everything at a whim accidentally or because they got fired and someone forgot that they were a super user. And so what we tend to do in the community is we suggest something like this. So it's a role, maybe the first role you create on a new server that you kind of use as your quote-unquote root user, that one role that you'll manage databases and other roles with in objects. Now, because they're not a super user, they cannot log into databases and just randomly delete stuff. A super user could. So you have that layer of control. And generally, there are others. I showed you what some of the attributes were, but we specifically try and give create role and maybe create DB, or one or the other. Maybe you have a role that's allowed to create databases and a role that's allowed to create other roles, something like that. That's up to you. About the only thing nowadays there are a couple others, but the one that might hit you is installing extensions. If you know Postgres and you know about extensions, they're really essential to the work that we do. And some of those extensions, you can actually identify you must be super user to install this. And there's reasons for that. The project over the last couple of years is working really hard to actually remove that need so that extensions can actually do the work they need without having to have a super user, and some mechanisms for that. So that is coming and partially done depending on where you're hosted and so forth. All right. Great, we're through all that. Now that we understand that we can connect, we have a role, we can create those roles initially, we then can talk about what privileges actually are. And so in Postgres, I am used to saying permissions. These are honestly just permissions, but in documentation and within the project, we call them privileges. And so they are the set of access rights to all those objects. And they can be granted and revoked, as you may expect if you've worked with any other SQL database. And the one thing to recognize, and I'll repeat this again later, especially during the demo, is one of those things I forget sometimes when I'm helping someone solve a problem and I run a grant or revoke statement, I forget that it only is an effect, or it only impacts the objects that exist at that moment, right? So sometimes I think, oh, I forgot to grant access. I'll just say grant all to this user on all tables, and like, whoo, good to go. And then a day later, I get a message saying, why can't I access that new table? Like, oh, that's right. That only impacted the objects that were in effect or existed at that moment. And so just recognize that when you're explicitly running grant or revoke commands, it's only going to impact objects that currently exist. So if something else gets created tomorrow, they'll have whatever privileges are by default on those objects, which we'll talk about here in just a few minutes. So I say Postgres 15 plus. Usually I try and keep this up to date, but quite honestly, these privileges haven't changed in many, many, many versions. So if you're using a supported version of Postgres, which is, I think at this point, technically, Postgres 13 and above, but certainly back to 9.6 and a bunch of others, these privileges still exist. There's been one change starting with Postgres 15, which is why I call this out. So by default, when a role gets created, all roles by default get connect, temporary, execute, and usage. There's a reason for that. And they're actually given through the next role we're going to talk about. But then the others make sense, hopefully, select, inserts, updates, deletes, and so forth. Now, I will give you a couple URLs, I think in 2 slides. This is one of those situations where select, or delete is a good example. Delete is a privilege for more than just a table. There are some other, you can do it for other objects. And so there's a couple pages where you might have to match up. Okay, when I say grant select or grant usage on this object, a sequence versus a database, what does that privilege give me? All right, so you'll be able to kind of trace that through the interface of these couple documents. That often comes up. Now, we get those 4 roles, those 4 privileges, through the public role. So we've already said in Postgres, by default, when it gets instantiated, we get a super user, and we get a database that is named the same as the super user, okay? There's always this other role called public. It's coded by default. You cannot remove the role. It just exists. And by default, it has these 4 privileges, again, from Postgres 15 and up: connect, usage, temporary, and execute. That means every single role that gets created is always a member of public. You can't change that. So when you start up a database, by default, people can connect to a database. Remember, every connection is to a database. So if a role doesn't have connect privilege to any database, you'll never get connected to the Postgres instance, okay? And so that's why these things are usually provided through that public role. You can change that. You could revoke all privileges on a database from the public role and then give them explicitly. But the project chose this many years ago to make it easy so that everyone that is, all roles that are created can at least connect to a database. But just because they can connect and they have usage doesn't mean they have any privileges to see anything in the database, right? That's then where you need to go further, granting select and so forth. And that, I said, in Postgres 14 and below, there was a fifth privilege that was given to public by default, and that was create. And as you'll see in the next section, about 5 or 6 years ago, we suddenly started to see more and more examples of a security issue. And so create was removed. And again, this was only on the public role, but that meant that every role that was created, if you didn't remove create, could, so I've used the word create like 5 times in one sentence, every role could create objects in the public schema. You couldn't, and so people were doing that. It's generally not good practice, and that would also then mean that if I knew that your extension or you were going to create this thing first, I could go in and create it, and as long as you didn't say, just create, if you say create or replace, for instance, I still would own it, and I could do nefarious things. So we got rid of that by default in Postgres 15 and above, and the recommendation is that we just revoke all privileges on public, and then you go ahead and start to do it on your own. Now, why doesn't the project do this? There's a couple reasons. Number one, people are on many different versions of Postgres, and so even if we made this change starting with Postgres 18 this fall, it's not going to impact all the things before us, right? And the project by default, kind of the ethos of the Postgres project and the community that is developing this, really has decided they don't want to make decisions for users that might impact their environment, right? They feel like they've tried to make some good default choices, even things like extensions. In a separate talk, I would talk about PG stat statements as an extension for being able to do your query analysis and do query tuning and so forth. It's available to everybody, it's easy to install, but it's not installed by default. And the reason is it might take 0.5% or 1% of a CPU, and the project is like, you know what? We don't want to make that choice to impact you that little bit of CPU. You can decide. And so things like this, by default, we have not removed those privileges from public, but it is actually our recommendation. So give and take, do what you will with that. And then granting privileges, again, hopefully makes sense, right? We say grant, we name what we're granting. You can reference multiple, if I grant something, I can say multiple things in a row for that particular object. So if an object like a table has multiple privileges, insert, update, select, delete, and so forth, you can grant all of them in one statement. And then I kind of give this example, and I'll do this in the demo. This is in a little bit of what I was saying earlier. So we have this user called admin, this role. See, I just did it. This role called admin. We have the schema called appdb, and we grant create. So that role can create objects in that database. And then we actually give this app role permission to create stuff in that database to dev1. And then maybe for a junior developer, they can't create, but they can update, insert, delete, and so forth. And then if we actually grant privileges to, next slide. This is what I said earlier. I repeated it a couple times because sometimes you say grant all to all these people, and then a week later someone can't select from the new table and you're still confused. And so just, again, remember that. It's hit me so many times, I guess I keep feeling like I need to say it many times. All right, so we'll get to the next thing of how you actually layer these things up. These are the URLs. I will make the slides available. If you happen to want to take a picture, I'll do that. I'll just pause for a second. But these 3 pages in documentation allow you to say, hey, if I have a table or I have a function, execute, for instance, what does execute do on a function versus maybe a procedure or something if they're different? And so you can kind of match those things up. These are the privileges, and then within a grant statement, here are the privileges that allowed and what they actually allow on that kind of object. All right. Now we get to talk about all this inheritance stuff, right? So we have roles. We have now granted privileges. We can understand that people can do something within this database. And inheritance is really essential to effectively running a Postgres database when it comes to role privileges. So you may remember I said earlier, by default, if you just say create role, that role will have inherit. So inherit is on by default. And what that means is if I am granted membership in another role, I can, without modifying my session user, I can inherit their privileges. And you'll see why this makes sense as I do the demo at the end of the presentation. But this is a good way to layer things up. I could create group roles for admin and for inserts or creates, as I said in the previous slide, and then maybe a group role for that select and insert update thing. And then I can grant membership appropriately into those roles to my other roles that are actually logging in. And generally, this is the preferred method of doing privilege management within Postgres. Not every role, number one, don't connect as a super user. Please don't, just stop it. and look at the slides I had earlier about something different. And then also, it's a good way to just manage what's happening within the database. So it looks a little bit like this. I create the role. So in this case, I just have a couple, right? We have 2 user roles, and they're users because we said login. We have a senior dev and a report user. And then we create this admin role and this read-only privileges role. And again, we're calling them a group because they can't log in. It's just semantics, but it's just what we do, and there's reason for it. Like we don't want to set passwords and have people logging in as these other groups. We want to know what's happening within the system. And then we can grant privileges to each of those roles appropriately. So in this case, we're saying insert, update, delete to the admin group role, and then select to the read-only privilege role. And finally, we can actually grant membership into those other roles. And because we're all inheriting, we can actually, get access to the roles as whatever privileges they have layered up. And the difference is this. So it just means by default, everyone has read-only privilege in that example, and then we granted to senior dev select, insert, update, and delete, right? So everyone had select, and then the other one had some additional because it meshed them all together. The big difference with inherit versus no inherit is this, and you'll see it in the demo. If I happen to say no inherit, and there are valid reasons for managing your privileges that way, it means that if I'm a member of that role, then during my session, I have to set my session to the other role if I want to do anything as that role. So let's say this role owns a table and I want to modify it. Even though I am a member of that role, if I don't have inherit, I have to intentionally go over to that role to do something. It's kind of like sudo, right? So there's a valid reason for that. Maybe you want that level of control, and maybe you don't, and you'll see an example of how this works together. So all of that wraps together, and honestly, the reason I originally did this presentation a number of years ago is because this hit me over and over again as I was trying to learn Postgres. I could create roles, and even though I didn't understand the semantics of groups or not groups, and I mostly understood the privileges, I didn't understand inherit at the time, right? As I'm putting these pieces together, we still had this problem that I wasn't always able to do what I wanted to do on the objects that I needed to do something with. One of my developers would go and create something, or they'd run a script on one of our databases to fix something, and then they'd go on vacation for a couple weeks or a couple days or whatever, and I would log in to try and fix it, and I couldn't do it unless I went to a super user role, and I was really frustrated by that. Like, what's going on? And it really comes down to object ownership in Postgres, and I think so many people get kind of wrapped around the axle on this one, that as they try and start to learn to use Postgres and they create these roles for the app, they still run into these permission problems and these privilege access issues. So an object creator is the owner by default. Now remember I said earlier in Postgres 15 and above, we removed that create privilege to the public role so that you, as another role by default, I can't just create things in the public schema. That is because whoever creates the object is the owner. And even if a super user could overwrite it, that doesn't change its ownership. And so you can imagine that's how the security breach would happen. I would say, hey, I know you're about to create this function. I'm going to go in and create this public function, then ask you as a super user to actually go create the function. Create or replace. And you do it and everyone's happy. But because now I still own that object, I'm the super user of that object. I now go back and I can modify that function and do some really great things because I'm going to ask you as a super user to run it or something like that. And so think about the object owner kind of as a super user of that object. And we really function from a principle of least privilege in Postgres. unless you do something to change it, every object is only accessible to the owner, or, and I say every object, I'm being a little bit global, it's not quite that black and white, but generally the objects that we care about, unless I do something, are only accessible to the owner or super user, and that can cause a lot of problems. And so this is where we have to recognize that we can either specifically run that grant privilege every time we create various objects, tables, views, functions, procedures, whatever it might be, or we can do something else that makes our life a little bit easier. Now, depending on the tooling you use, the tooling itself, so for instance, if you happen to do a PG dump to move a database, maybe a dump schema, so you're going to create a new version of that database somewhere. By default, PGDump will export the privileges, so you'll have lots of grant statements or revoke statements within that backup. Other tooling might not. You know, if you use a tool like, I just came from Redgate, something like Flyway or a former tool similar to that, that gets your schema out, it may or may not include those grant statements. And so you want to have in place something that gives you an assurance that privileges are actually set up as you expect. And this is where I come back to this slide, right? If we're not careful and we give lots of developers access to a database, even a dev database, can be a real pain in the butt if you're not, if you don't have the right access to it. And so rather than everyone getting all this access to create whatever they want, we want to deal with what we call default privileges and using one or a very small number of roles to create our objects and manage our objects. And so again, this will all come together in the demo in about 3 more slides. You never guess what happened next. So we do default privileges, and here's what almost no one realizes these things exist. Default privileges are a way for you as that role. So these only exist for the role that creates them. So as in this case, I don't even know what role I was. Let's say I'm that admin role. And every time I create a table in this case, I'm saying grant select on table to public. So everyone's a member of the public role. And so if I want everyone to have select access on that table, that's an easy way to do it. And now, every time I create an object, Postgres goes and looks at the default privileges and says, hey, are there any default privileges this role has said to set when, in this case, a table gets created? And in this case, yes. This is a really nice and easy way to manage how privileges get propagated throughout your database with the various objects that you have. It does take some management, and it's something to get used to doing. But that then means if we kind of manage how things run against our database, and we always run our create or DDL or version scripts as that specific role, then these privileges will get created consistently script after script. And so that's one of the things I would encourage you to start to look at in your environments. If you're doing version migrations, things like that, you can do this as simply as if you're managing the file yourself, at the very top, just say set role and whatever your ownership role is going to be. Maybe it's app admin, maybe it's DDL owner or whatever. That role, you set your session to that role and then run your statements, and they become the owner of that thing. If you're using something like Flyway, is a tool that a lot of us have used for doing migrations, and other tools have something similar. It has actually a switch in NetSQL, and so you could say, hey, in NetSQL for this session, set role to whatever role, and then it will run the migration scripts as that role. So there are multiple ways to do something like that, but if you do this, then all of these objects will consistently have the same privileges as they're created. Now, quick question. If I happen to modify the default privilege later, does that modify the privilege of the things that are already created? And the audience says, good, I see at least one head shaking no. No, it doesn't. So you do have to, let's say I want to add or remove a privilege. I then have to manually go and revoke that privilege because it's already set, right? This is a separate thing only at creation, but very, very helpful. And so all of this, all of these things really comes down to managing your roles effectively and then access to the objects you need to. And so there are a couple ways to do that. You can explicitly grant access, right? So we talked about that before. You can have lots and lots of grant statements for every role, for every permission, after every object, and it will work. And if you can manage it, go for it. Option 2 is to say alter default privileges, which I tend to lean towards if I'm actually managing a larger project and I want things to be consistent and I manage exactly how these things get created over time. If I use default privileges, then I need to actually set a role when I do these things, or I just intentionally make sure I always set my connection to that role, so at least I know if something needs to be fixed. If any other role is a member of that group or that specific group role, then they can do something with it. And again, you'll see that in just a minute. And then finally, for Postgres 14+, you can imagine one of the things that really annoyed so many people, myself included, is there was no really easy way to create a read-only user in a Postgres database, because every object had to be set. Remember, principle of least privilege. And so in Postgres 14+, there's been an enormous amount of effort over the last 5 years to create more and more of what we call predefined roles, which I'll show you at the very end, one slide. And the predefined roles allow you to do some things like read all data. Now, what that means is this. As long as they can connect to the database, right, they have that connect privilege, then they can read all the data from all the tables, right? It overrides whatever other privileges you have. Pro, con, good, bad, that's up to you to decide. But these are some of the ways we're trying to provide that access rather than you having to manage it specifically. And there's lots of other predefined roles coming. And the whole point of this is we're trying to use predefined roles to get rid of the need for that super user, right? As much as possible. Things that I used to have to be super user for, we want to provide a predefined role for that function so that you can grant it to an administrative role of some sort. So you don't have to actually be a super user. All right. Any quick questions before I do my simple demo to try and hopefully make this all hit home? Excellent. And I'll do this even though I know there's not. There we go. All right. So we're going to breeze through this quickly. But what I want to show you is, hopefully, and I think I have reset this database, so this should all work. Generally, what I just told you, what I just showed you in slides, right? So you can actually see how this actually functions, and hopefully it connects just a little bit more. So I'm going to create a couple of roles. So developer, in my case, is going to be kind of that main role that I want to manage my objects with. So I'm going to create the developer role, and I'm using dbeaver here. Is that big enough for everyone to see? Okay, and I usually do this. My apologies. So that developer role. Now, this is what I was saying. When I'm in a session, remember, I'm connected to a database as something. In this case, I'm connected as the Postgres user, which is a super user, which I told you never to do. But for demo purposes, it just makes my life really easy. So let's pretend, shall we? Okay. So we have the developer role. Now, anytime I say set none, that resets the current session to whatever role I connected as. In this case, Postgres, which is a super user. So I'm just doing that to make sure that I'm a super user. The super user or my super user-like role can grant privileges. And so I'm going to grant select, insert, update, delete to that developer role to schema public. And then I'm going to create, I'm going to also allow them to create objects on schema public. I'm going to create 2 developer roles. Now these are actually user roles because they can log in and they have a password and they're set to inherit, right? So I know that they will be able to inherit the privileges from the other roles that they become members of. And I'm going to do just that. So I'm going to say, hey, to dev1, grant membership into the developer role. And as dev2, do the same thing. So now all of my developers in this project are all a member of the developer role, which has the privilege to create stuff in public and to select, insert, update, and delete. Makes sense. Hopefully that all works well. So again, because I'm a super user, I can do this. Normally, I would set up multiple connections, but it gets confusing. So just pretend with me that I have connected as dev1 to this database. And so dev1 connects to the database and creates a table for his new project or his new ticket for this application. And we can see that that dev does actually own, I think I have, come on, you can do it. There we go. Dev1 does own that table, all right? Now, Dev2 comes along, Dev1 goes on vacation. Dev2 comes along and says, we need to add that new column for this project. They're both a member of the developer role. They both have inherit. To me, it would seem like, yeah, that's probably easy enough. But I can't. It says you must be owner of the object to modify the object. And this is where most people just start saying, what's going on here? Why can't I do this? I have all the privileges in the world. And the reason is you don't own it. And so how can we try and get around this? And how are some ways that you can modify this? So I'm going to go back to super user just so I can delete something. Remember, super user can do anything. So I'm just going to delete a table even though I don't own it. But let's try it a different way. Dev1 and Dev2 are a member of developer. What if developer created that table? So we're going to pretend we're the developer role. And sorry, I said dbeaver earlier. My apologies. You probably are normally expecting me to highlight stuff. That's too slow for me. I'm just hitting Control-Enter, which executes the statement that my cursor is currently on. I forget to say that sometimes. So we're going to create that new table as developer. And sure enough, developer is the owner of the table. Now, Dev1 is still on vacation. Dev2 comes around and says, all right, let's go ahead and add that column. And now Dev2 can add the column, which we can see. And that's because developer owns it, and I'm a member of developer, and I have inherit. If I didn't have inherit, but I'm still a member, I would first have to have said, as Dev2, set role developer. And then I could do this. Does that make sense? How those things work together? Okay. So this is great. So now Dev1 and Dev2 can do whatever they need to this table because they are a member of that role. So let's get around to the last piece before we run out of time. And so now we decide, oh, I really thought I updated this one to say, my apologies, I updated it somewhere. Normally it should say Star Trek. But anyway, here we go. We're going to create that report user. So now the project, we have this reporting need, and we want to make sure the report user runs these nightly reports but can't modify any data. And so it just needs to be a read-only user. And so create a user, a role. We're going to set to that role. So we have the role. We know they can connect because they were given connect privilege through public and so forth. But they can't select from that table yet because it already existed and no one was given permissions to it other than the owners or super user. And so there are a couple ways to do this. Now again, I could say set none, or I could say set developer. I could say any of these to grant privilege to that role, to that table. And so developer created the table. As long as I connect as developer or can shift into that role, I can say, hey, grant select on all to report user. Sweet. So we do that. I don't know what that was. Ignore that. Now as report user, I can go ahead and select from that table. Okay, cool. But what did I say about doing it that way? I just said grant select to report user. What happens when we come around as developer and we now create that table specifically for these reports? Anybody? Wah, wah, wah. All right, so you can't do it. And so this is where these default privileges come around. So I'm going to go back to developer. I'm going to delete that table to show you this. And so now, as the role, and this is where you go back to those slides, I'm encouraging you to look at how you want to manage your objects and think about the role, or maybe one or two roles, although that could already start to get complicated, that are going to own the objects. And so if I shift into that role, whatever it's going to be, and I create these default privileges, so in this case, I'm simply doing one for the report user. I could do it for many roles. I could do many different privileges, whatever needs to happen. And I say, alter my default privileges, developers' default privileges, and grant select to all the tables I create to report user, right? So this is essentially read-only privilege to that user. And I'm going to create that table now. So now I'm still developer. I create that same table. And then, as we tried before, the report user connects at some other point, and now they can select from it because we set up default privileges, and I didn't have to worry about it. And especially if you have multiple levels and layers of roles, your application, again, maybe you have that microservice kind of architecture, and you have multiple databases and roles that you're trying to manage between your databases. This is a great way to manage that stuff. Again, it takes some effort, but it is something you can do, all right? Now, I will say this, it gets complicated to delete roles in, drop roles in Postgres, because anytime a role has access to anything, you have to remove all of its access everywhere before it can actually be dropped, which honestly is a pretty good thing. So that is my short demo. Hopefully that makes it just enough clear of what's going on, that something you can take with you, watch the video. These scripts are available on my GitHub repo, which is why I put it on my slide. You can download all this stuff and run it yourself. And honestly, that script will work in any version of Postgres, so go for it. And this is the last thing just to mention. We do have these predefined roles, and again, these are cluster level roles. So if I give, for instance, that read all data role, it applies to all databases in the instance as long as the user, the role, can connect to that database, right? If I take connect privilege away, then it can't, or usage privilege away, it can't. But as long as it can connect and use it, it can read all the data. So that's a good example. This was probably Postgres 16 would be my guess. I don't remember if we've added anything with Postgres 17, to be honest. But this is, again, as I said earlier, we're trying to use role. I say we because I love the project. I haven't coded anything in Postgres yet. Maybe someday. But we're trying to do this as a way to get around having to be super user. For instance, there's this thing called stats, which is really good for tracking all kinds of stuff, but particularly for query tuning, all the various things that's happening in the database. Unless you have an application to do it, you actually have to track their cumulative statistics. You actually have to take snapshots of statistics over time to get that delta and understand what's happening in your database. Well, if you didn't have that set up and all of a sudden your database goes haywire, usually the recommendation was, well, log in as super user, reset stats, and then start to track it, and you'll see what's going up, what counter's going up quickly. Well, now we don't want super user to do that. So there's actually a role that is reset stats, and I don't know if it's on here. Yes, PG read all stats. I think there's a read all settings, I think is the one that it is. That allows you to reset the actual stats without being a super user. So we're trying to get through some of those things just to make that a little bit better. So we probably technically don't, is 3:45? Is that the end? Okay. So if you have any questions, I love to connect people with others at Postgres. I've been in this project for, like I said, 7 years. I don't know everything by any stretch. It's a long 30-plus year project. I've had a really good privilege of just meeting lots and lots of people across the globe in the project. So if I don't know, I probably have a decent idea who to connect you with. And I love doing that. I love people to get connected and learn this application better. Please feel free to reach out on any of those platforms. A lot of different talks and slides and other things in my GitHub repo. And again, if you came in late, I'm going to go to the very top. Oh, that's not what I meant to do. As I finish, can I just go, I don't know how to do it on a Mac because I haven't done a Mac in a long time. But there's a free book if you want to get it, which I recently released with a friend of mine in the database environment. So go for it. It's been a pleasure. Thank you. Come find me if you have any question about Postgres. I love talking. Cheers.